Good evening and welcome to the Davidson Forum. My name is Daniel Heath and I have the privilege of serving as the inaugural director of the Davidson Forum. We're so excited to have you this evening. You could be in a lot of places like over there, but we're glad that you chose to be with us. We chose a topic and date intentionally with tomorrow's election in mind, with hopes that you will leave informed, inspired, and maybe even challenged. We'd like to thank especially those tuning in online. Thank you for joining us. And the recording of tonight's panel will be made available on the Davidson Forum landing page after Thanksgiving. I'd like to thank all of those who contributed to make tonight possible, including Gladys Newport, our department coordinator, digital event staff, and the technical services staff. Thank you all. Many have asked, what is the Davidson Forum? We have worked closely with the staff in college communications, and we are happy to announce that we will release a video at the end of the year that answers that very question. For now, the Davidson Forum is a way for Davidson College and the surrounding communities to engage in four what we call pillars: the Reformed tradition, religious pluralism, social ethics, and liberal arts education. The forum will facilitate these engagements through speaker series, panel discussions like the one that will be offered tonight, experiential learning opportunities, and a newsletter. So please let us know if we can add your name to our Davidson Forum listserv by emailing us at davidsonforum@davidson.edu. Others have asked, what is a Reformed tradition? Now I'm going to try to do this in 20 seconds. The Reformed tradition was developed through the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, and the Reformed tradition prioritizes humanistic liberal arts education, and it affirms that institutions need to be reformed over time in light of evolving cultural contexts. Consequently, this living tradition spurs the college's pursuit of new ways to respectfully engage current intellectual, social, and cultural realities, including our broadly diverse, pluralistic community of faculty, staff, students, alumni, and friends. I'm honored to introduce to some and present to others our panelists for our panel on religion and politics. And after brief introductions, each panelist will offer opening remarks from their field of expertise. I might ask a follow-up question, but we reserve our remaining time for you to engage with your response and your questions about religion and politics. Now for introductions. Dr. Ceka is the chair and associate professor of political science. Dr. Ceka teaches courses in international relations and comparative politics with a particular focus on European politics. His research and teaching interests lie in the fields of public opinion, political behavior, European integration, international organizations, and post-communist politics. He examines the causes and consequences of political trust and satisfaction with democracy in Europe. Dr. Susan Roberts is a professor of political science. Dr. Roberts teaches courses in Congress, the presidency, parties and interest groups, and campaign strategy and public policy. Her research includes work in activism on reproductive policy, interest groups, political capital, and hashtag politics, among others. She is the 2020 recipient of the Diane Blair Award from the Southern Political Science Association, presented biannually to a political scientist who has played an outstanding role in politics and/or government during his or her career. Dr. Doug Ottati is the Craig Family Distinguished Professor of Reformed Theology and Justice and my colleague with the Davidson Forum. Dr. Ottati teaches courses in Reformed Theology and Ethics, the Christian Faith, Being Human, Prophetic Christianity in America during the 20th century, and John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, among others. His scholarly interests include contemporary theology and ethics, as well as the history of theology and ethics in America. He is the past president of the Society of Christian Ethics. Tonight's program will be followed with a reception here in the 900 room, and we hope each of you will join us for further discussion. Friends, help me welcome our panelists.
Can you hear me? Not yet. Yeah. Now it's good? Okay. Thank you very much, Daniel, for that introduction. And thank you all for being here tonight. I know we have many competing events, and it's very impressive to see so many people here. My expertise is in European politics, so my remarks, hoping to spend about 10 minutes on this, my remarks will be confined to what I know, to the region of the world that I know, and will be based mostly on my research. And I just happen to have a line of work that has been published recently that, while not directly on religious or the link between religion and politics, it indirectly speaks quite a bit to it. And I will present some of the main findings that are related to tonight's topic. So there are two main points that I would like to make tonight. And they are paradoxical when heard side by side. One is that the religious vote, and I have a couple of slides to help with this, mostly just data, but the first slide to situate the discussion. So 2 points I would like to make. First point is that the religious vote, and by that I mean the influence that religion and religious identity has on voting choice, preferences for various parties in Europe, both East and West, has decreased significantly since the 50s and 60s. We see trends, study after study, that show a great deal of reduction in the correlation between having strong religious identity, church attendance, and the kinds of parties that people support. It used to be a much more pronounced relationship. On the other hand, religion and religious considerations, especially religious identity, has become a very important factor in European politics, especially in shaping attitudes, in shaping political tolerance, and indirectly in shaping voting choice. So how can it be both ways? So I'm going to try to explain this paradox mostly by focusing on the latter point. The former point, meaning the decline of the religious vote, is well established. It is shown, as I said, in study after study. But at the same time, we have an increased importance given to religious identity. To explain this point, I'm going to rely, as I hinted, on an article that I recently co-authored with a colleague of mine. I'm just putting here the abstract and the title in case you want to follow up. You can find this article on my website. It's available, the whole article, but just so you have an idea of what we're talking about here. It's called Political Tolerance in Europe, the Role of Conspiratorial Thinking and Cosmopolitanism. It's a co-authored article with a friend of mine and a fellow political scientist from Germany. And it investigates the state of political tolerance in Europe by focusing specifically on how much Europeans tolerate most disliked groups. We, and by we I mean political scientists, like to think of political tolerance being a crucial feature of liberal democracies, tolerating those that might practice different religions, might have different ways of thinking about this world and the afterlife, as being a healthy sign of democracy. So we wanted to look into what are the determinants of political tolerance, defined as essentially acceptance of other ways of thinking and representation of interest. And what became very clear is that if you actually look at the descriptive data, if you look at the survey results, in terms of the most disliked groups, all of a sudden religious identity, specifically Muslims, right, in Europe becomes a very highly salient group, and one that comes second in this group of countries. And by the way, we have 10 European countries that include also Eastern European countries here. So this is not representative of the whole region of Western and Eastern Europe, just a subset of them, but nonetheless, it's an important set of countries. When Europeans are asked about the most disliked groups, they identify neo-Nazis and fascists as the most disliked group, but closely followed, or I shouldn't say closely followed because the gap is pretty big, but its second place are Muslims, then Roma, communists, anti-globalization activists. Lower on the list, you have Jews as well, but that is less than 1% of the Europeans who identified Jews as the most disliked group. So there's at least two groups here that have religious identity at the core of their, or religion being at the core of their identity. So we were interested in explaining these factors, but for this part, I want to focus on the actual findings, the descriptive findings with regards to religious identity. If you look at the countries, you can see the distribution of those that identify the various groups as the most or the least liked. I'm not sure how well you can see from the back, but hopefully you can. So in Czech Republic, for example, 30% of the respondents identified the neo-Nazis and fascists, and 22% identify Muslims. Those numbers changed quite a bit in Germany for a variety of reasons. Quite understandably, neo-Nazis and the fascists are the most disliked groups, Muslims only at 12%. But what's really interesting is that if you follow up with those that identify the most disliked group and ask them about one very fundamental issue of trying to move it one slide, and I'm having an issue. There we go. Okay. Yes. So when asked whether the most disliked group should be denied representation in parliament, which is a pretty big deal, right? Because we accept representation in parliament to be a fundamental right in democracies. More than half of all the respondents in each of these countries would be more than happy to deny political representation to the groups that they dislike, which is quite of a concerning fact, especially if you aggregate the numbers, you get some pretty unsettling numbers. So what role does religious identity play? How has religious identity and the religious vote reshaped itself in more recent years so we can move away from the narrative of religious voting losing significance, and how it has become an important element of European society? That's the more important question. I don't know how familiar you are with contemporary European politics, especially Western European politics, but increasingly so Eastern European politics as well. The most important domestic issue, I would say, is immigration. And immigration in the European context is tightly linked with religious identity, especially with Muslim immigration and fears of Muslim immigration. So these factors, especially the politicization of immigration from the Northern African countries, from Middle East and other parts of the world with Muslim majority populations, Turkey included, have created an atmosphere where intolerance towards migrants is channeled quite strongly towards or into intolerance towards Muslims. So one of the most potent political issues of the day in Europe is that of immigration, and as it relates to Muslim immigration. If you look at the political representation or the political attitudes of the various classes and political ideologies, people that espouse various political ideologies, it becomes quite clear and unsurprisingly that the far right is much more invested in this intolerance. And we see this all both at the attitudinal level. So the data you see here, these are respondents, representative survey respondents from 10 European countries, where they would put themselves on a scale from the far left to the far right. And if you look at the far right, the bottom bar there, you will notice that on the far right, only 22% of the respondents identify neo-Nazis and fascists as the most disliked group, but 31% identify Muslims. And that number, unsurprisingly, gets lower and it flips as you go to the far left. So this is an issue that is concentrated on the far right. And the role that politics or religion, the renewed importance of religion in European politics, I would say, is centered on a couple of issues related to immigration, but also that are distinct from immigration. So the immigration one is the most obvious one, the one that I've already alluded to. A lot of people coming in, a lot of them, especially in the 2015 refugee crisis, many of them coming from Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, created an almost existential fear situation and concerns among the native populations about being overrun by migrants, by especially Muslim migrants. We don't hear so much about Ukrainian refugees, although there are millions of them throughout Europe, that it's much easier to assimilate them, or at least to absorb them. They have not been politicized in the European context currently. But when it comes to the Muslim immigrants, especially refugees and asylum seekers, this has been a highly salient political issue that has been weaponized by the far right. And you see a re-emergence of a religious identity in the sense of a stark contrast between traditionalist values put forth by the new far right movements. And they make the contrast between the traditional Christian values and the Muslim religion, and intolerance from Muslim fundamentalists provides ammunition to these far right parties. You see similar patterns with fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism becoming a propaganda issue in Russia prior to the war in Ukraine. For many years, the Putin regime actually, according to some analysts, hit a gold mine of propaganda when they started targeting the LGBT community, because it was a very popular set of policies and a targeting that the regime did in order to bolster support among the population because of latent attitudes within Russia. That is separate from the refugee and the migrant issue, but there is a renewed emphasis on religious identity that is coming from the right. And that has managed to get supporters from left parties, traditional social democratic parties, to move to the far right, because they feel, many of the supporters of former supporters of the left feel that they have been abandoned by left parties that have turned post-materialist, they have turned more moderate in their support for migrants and refugees. So they find a home among far right parties, which in the past had very little connection to religious identity, but they have figured out a way of making religious identity a salient issue and a powerful motivating factor in mobilizing support among former supporters of socialist parties and various other center-right parties, conservative parties that have moved to the right. So religious vote, to summarize my quick remarks, because we have been limited to 10 minutes, and I'm happy to discuss many of these issues later. But to summarize, religious voting has decreased in terms of the importance that it has on the parties that people support. At the same time, we see in more recent years a renewed emphasis on religious identity when it comes to intolerance and stigmatizing various groups in society, especially Muslims, and also religious identity playing a larger role among supporters of far-right parties in various European countries. I will end my remarks at this point and let my colleagues continue. Thank you very much.
Excuse me. Thanks to the Religious Forum, and thanks to you for coming. I'm probably the only one on the panel that is going to make reference to this, and it depends on a certain genre and a certain demographic. If my remarks had a theme song, it would be REM's Losing My Religion. And I'm going to talk about the nuns. These are not the Black Habits and the Ruler nuns. These are the nuns that exist in American politics, and they're related to the unaffiliated voter. As we talked about earlier, my research has been on abortion activism, not on religion and politics. But I've particularly been interested because of an article I worked with several colleagues in Social Science Quarterly entitled Growing and Distinct: The Unaffiliated Voter as an Unmoored Voter. And Doug, we concluded that, quote, voters who eschew party labels are best understood as unmoored voters, hovering close to their ideological docks, but with no institutional constraint to keep them from drifting as the political tide shifts. Doug has assured me that this is not a Presbyterian hymn. Throw out the lifeline. Someone is drifting away. And I'm looking at those nuns in the context, as you know, of hyperpolarization, hyper-partisan antipathy, higher institutional distrust, and the nation becoming more ethnically and racially diverse. So what I'm saying is pretty straightforward. And I decided there would be a number of topics to look at with religion. Religion and electoral activity, religion and an issue agenda, religion and morality policy, religion and the Supreme Court, and civic engagement, and as someone suggested, our recent Speaker of the House and discussion of Christian nationalism. That was a little bit above my pay grade, so I decided to look at something that reminded me of the independent voter. Tocqueville, who I always begin my talks with in class, wrote that we are a nation of joiners, and Americans have a great propensity to join groups. And I think that is important to what I'm saying. Robert Putnam wrote a book, Bowling Alone, in which he really decried the lack of associations in this country, equating it with almost the decline of civilization, because he said civic organizations really help with a sense of community, bridging and bonding social capital, and really a kind of series of trust. So Bowling Alone, and someone else wrote an article, Nicholas Layman, called Kicking in Groups, meaning that that's not the only way that we have social capital. And so what interests me, in addition to the unmoored voter, were a series of scholarly and popular articles. One scholarly article was entitled, "Did the Nuns Put Joe Biden in the White House? An Analysis of Voting Patterns of the Religiously Unaffiliated 2020. And the article just assumed that Trump, and looked and found that Trump had a decline in his baseline vote, especially from 2016 to 2020. Biden did better, and that there are small shifts that can decide an election. Another article was, more and more Americans aren't religious. Why are the Democrats ignoring these voters? And that was September 2020. And they acknowledged the challenge of organizing. They acknowledged that these voters were difficult to reach because they don't have church attendance. They have a lack of institutional leadership, and any overt appeal by the Democrats to the non-religious is risky, because you risk the people that both attend church and people that are spiritual and have faith. But they concluded that there is growing antipathy toward Donald Trump, and in his portrayal of America as a Christian nation, his agenda with LGBTQ, access to abortion, and also things such as counter rights. And the last article was in Politico in 2023, and it's called "The Religious Landscape is Undergoing Massive Change. It Could Decide the 2024 Election." And they talk about the God gap, and that is the degree to which people assume that the Republican Party is the party that will protect religious believers. And he talked about the fact that Democrats are becoming more secular over time, and I'll make reference to that. But they also quote, and this body sounds fascinating, the United States Association of Statisticians of America religious bodies. And every 10 years, they look at church attendance. They ask churches how many people are coming to your church. And if they see something that looks really like a discrepancy given the size of the church, they actually go out and count the number of cars in the parking lot to look at a more realistic view of religious attendance. So I knew there was something going on when we looked at these in the scholarly articles. I'm going to do something that most people don't do. I'm going to give you, in case you decide to go to the basketball game, you get bored and run out of time, Here are up front the 5 takeaways. Okay, you don't listen to anything else. These are the takeaways from the talk. The first is the nuns are growing steadily as the number of persons in the United States that are religiously affiliated decreases. Nuns up, religious affiliates down. Second, okay, counting is difficult. Counting the nuns is difficult. Third, and perhaps more importantly, the nuns are not a monolith, and I'll go into the different distinctions of the nuns. 4, what accounts for their increase and their complexity. And lastly, what interests me a little as a political scientist, the nuns continue to rise as the numbers identify themselves as independents from partisan identification increases as well. So I want to look later on, is there a connection between the independent voter and the unaffiliated? First, they're growing numbers. And this is widely acknowledged, and that is about 30 to 34% of Americans consider themselves or identify as nuns. Okay, there's not a nun church or anything like that. They do talk about things that you do other things, that there's yoga and spiritualism, being a person that is a humanist. A person who's written a book about nuns characterizes, if there were a graph, it would be a hockey stick, and that they've really increased since 2006. They've gone from, the unaffiliated have gone from 26.8 in 2020, from 16 in 2006. The white evangelical Protestants have gone down they're now 13.9%, and they were 17.8, I should round those, in 2006. The white mainline Protestants are down. They were 13.5% in 2006, and they were 17.8, 18%, and they're down to 13%. The Catholics are down to 12.5 from 16 in 2006. And scholars say there are as many nuns as there are Catholics and about evangelical Protestants in the United States. And meaning that political scientists and religious scholars and sociologists are going to take this into account when they look at the numbers and the distinctions. There's very little chance, scholars write, that the unaffiliated are going to return. There's also a life cycle event, so they may have something that occurs. Sometimes a nun might, N-O-N-E-S, a nun might marry and have children, and that is more of an impetus to say, I want my children to grow up in a church. But there's general agreement that the nuns are understudied and misunderstood. If we look at religious membership, it's plummeted among the Democrats. 1999, 2021, the Democrats went from 45 to 70% religiously affiliated to 45%, 70 to 45. The Republicans went from 80% to 60%. And really, when you think about it, there's general agreement that this is a phenomenon that is here to stay because of the increase in growth, the decrease. They have to come from somewhere. So they're coming from other churches. The second takeaway is counting is difficult. And some of that is because some surveys talked about the nuns as nuns. And as I'll talk about in point 3, the nuns are not a monolith. So sometimes they ask questions about the nuns, and later surveys talk about the nuns and divide them into, which I will do, 3 groups: the atheist, the agnostics, and the NIPS. The atheist, the agnostic, and the NIPS. The NIPS are nothing in particular. And seriously, that's what they call these people. But what do they have in common besides checking the same box? And the surveys I read so many surveys and they give different definitions and different numbers. Secondly, the time of study. The Time magazine had a cover story about the rise of the nuns, and this was in 2012, and it's been exponential since then. Also, the type of survey, and this is something when I look at independence, social desirability, and that people are not content giving or doing a face-to-face and say something that might be controversial about drug use or their views on same-sex marriage. And they may be hesitant to say, I'm a nun, because it's not very socially desirable. Online, they found better responses. And of course, all this is in the context of what happened with survey research during COVID. And where do you find them? There's not a coalition. The only thing possible in terms of physical place, could it be Starbucks? I mean, you can't go somewhere and see the nuns. My third is that the nuns are not a monolith. And this is very important, probably the most important thing that I will say. The nuns, according to an AP poll, the nuns are united by a dislike of organized religion, a dislike of leaders, a dislike of its politics, and a dislike of its social stances. That's pretty dislike, okay? Atheist, we said they're about 30 to 34% of Americans consider themselves nuns. 7% are atheist, 7% are agnostic, and 16% are the NIPS, nothing in particular. And the atheist, which I think is interesting, 41% are college educated. They very rarely, if ever, would think of voting or identifying as Republicans. One source said that they are more dogmatic and more disagreeable than the average American, and they're less likely to talk about political values with their family, but they're very politically active. Of the atheists, the agnostics, and the NIPS, they're much more politically active, okay? The second group, the agnostics, 41% for the atheist, 34% of the agnostics are college educated. Two, they're rarely identify with the Republican Party. They're open to a God. They're more likely to be involved in politics than the NIPS, but not quite as much as the atheist, okay? And they're less likely to talk about values with their families. The stars of the show are the NIPS. And 41, 34, only 28% of the NIPS are college educated. They exhibit a lot of political apathy. They're not politically active, and they're relatively uninterested in politics. They're less likely to feel politically efficacious, and they have a lower income than the atheist and the agnostics, and they could become a part of the GOP, or what I call the hillbilly elegy factor. And that is they do feel marginalized, and they do have feelings that no one's listening. They're not just apathetic, they're a little alienated. And Burge, who's written the book on the nuns, said, it's hard to overemphasize at this point, but NIPS may be the most important religious group in the United States. Fourth, what accounts for their increase? And we've talked about that, established their increase. One thing that's written about is their antipathy towards Trump. Now, we can just think about what's going to happen in 2024, the indictments, whatever else happens, and the continued presence of Trump in politics, and the Republican Party is the party of Trump. Also, socialization and social isolation. This was a factor even before COVID, the social isolation. And the nuns are not as socialized as church-going or religiously affiliated. There is a third point under this one, a loss of trust in institutions across the board. Congress, the presidency, and more recently, which, you know, might be a problem for some of us that look at this as the higher court, the high court, loss of trust in the Supreme Court. You see what might increase in their numbers. It would be the issue agenda. And organized religion is more attuned and will take, you know, has to have a position on access to abortion, on LGBTQ rights, and the culture wars, which do exist, things like transgender rights, religion and religious affiliations usually will have something to say about that. And Brookings talks about the rise of the younger voter and the decline of the white evangelical. And I was talking to someone in the religion department. I'm not getting into defining Christian nationalist, defining an evangelical. And fifth, the resemblance to independence, something I'm interested in. There are growing numbers of independents. 49% of Americans identify as independents, 25 identify as Democrats, and 25 as Republicans. So let's just say 50, 25, 25. They're both understood because there's been a myth of the independent voter. The independent voter is not the voter that is more sophisticated, that chooses necessarily the candidate over the party. Some independent voters are just lazy and politically apathetic. If you look at independents as well as the unaffiliated, the nones, it's much easier to say you're unaffiliated or you're a none. It's much easier to say you're an independent than to have to really defend a certain religion or to defend a certain party. And again, social desirability, especially the independent voter, want to be liked and they want this social desirability. And saying you're an independent doesn't alienate people. They're growing among the youth, and the partisan antipathy may be like the agnostics because the Republicans regard the Democrats. Democrats are usually a little more charitable. They regard them as, and these are the words in the Pew Research Center, close-minded, lazy, immoral, unintelligent, and dishonest. How do people regard the nones? If I were to conclude, I would say undoubtedly the nones are going to increase. Will the NIPS increase? What will happen when we become in 2040 and 2050 a majority minority nation? If I were telling any politician, I would tell them today, not with religion, don't message to the independents because some of these are lazy. They don't turn out to vote. Nor would I say message to the nones because that's risky. And I think if you look at who this might benefit, given we're not talking about Christian nationalism, I think it's 60-40. This is my opinion that it will benefit the Democrats more than the Republicans. Thanks.
Well, thank you all for being here. You're going to be treated to hearing me as a theologian, which is a lot better than watching me play basketball. So I think that's probably a good thing. What I'm going to try and do is just lay out a theological position out of a certain sort of Protestantism and ask what its political implications are. So it's a normative talk, right? I mean, it's a theological talk. There are, of course, multiple Christian traditions, Catholic, Lutheran, Evangelical, etc., and the differences sometimes are politically relevant. They're not always politically relevant. Sometimes they are. I address our topic as a Reformed theologian who represents a variety of Protestantism that emerged in the 16th century, as my colleague Daniel has said, 16th century in Europe, and with which Presbyterianism and this college are connected. I am going to present a more or less mainline or old line point of view, though there's more than one point of view in the old line or the main line. This one's going to be a little bit more Presbyterian shaded. I was very encouraged by the 13.5% figure, Susan, that might be mainline in America. That's the highest percentage I've heard in a long time. And all you Presbyterian ministers out there ought to feel a little better than you did at the last conference I attended with you. Reformed Protestantism encourages believers to participate in the polis, right, where the word politics comes from. Some Christian traditions, Amish, Mennonite, for example, are not as keen to do this. Moreover, unlike most current journalism, Reformed Christianity takes a broad view of politics as life in the polis or in the city, its government, economic structures, and cultural patterns before God. So it's not just electoral politics. You should go vote. But my tradition is not telling you that politics reduces to voting and civil government. It encourages believers to participate in many social arenas, institutions, and roles, and it wants to ask what kind of a participation makes sense. Consider the ethos of Reformed Protestantism. That is its constellation of beliefs, practices, and sentiments. I want to do that to try and set up a kind of orientation in these matters. One major point is simply that God and God's purposes come first. Reformed worship begins with hymns and prayers praising and adoring the transcendent God. It does not begin with yet another therapeutic worry about how we're doing today. It doesn't, right? You just want to keep that in mind. Likewise, the Westminster Catechism claims that the chief end of the human being is to glorify God and enjoy God forever. It does not say my chief end is my own interests and life goals. It does not say my prime purpose is to make all the money I can. Not saying you can't have those goals, just can't have it to be a Reformed theologian. That's all I'm saying. Go ahead, you have at it. Second, in Christ, God's kingdom or the fulfillment of God's purposes takes a specific pattern, namely love of neighbor. All have worth in relation to the gracious God who bestows benefits and gifts. God's kingdom therefore blesses the vulnerable and the poor. This is actually, you have the quartet of the vulnerable run throughout the Old Testament and the Hebrew scriptures as well. The kingdom blesses the vulnerable and the poor, and we should love even our enemies. And if you think about that, that means everybody. You know, I mean, you got friends, you got enemies. So how far does the love of God extend? To enemies, well, that's it. It's over now. That extends everywhere, huh? That's the point. That's also one of the reasons why the Sermon on the Mount is difficult stuff when you read it, and almost no one measures up. You might want to keep that in mind too. This is the mind or attitude of Christ Jesus and his moral teachings, the Lord's Prayer, etc. A steep standard from which we chronically fall short. Hence, in an age marked by a rhetoric of inflated self-righteousness, good Reformed worship prays that God's kingdom come. It also includes a corporate prayer in which we confess our persistent sin and seek forgiveness and renewal. If you make it through a bunch of these services and you end up thinking that you alone have escaped with self-righteousness, you're a very creative person. You really need to listen to what's going on in those services. That's not the way they're structured. I know that's the way a lot of Americans talk. I know it's the way a lot of Americans think, but it's not Reformed theology. Just like to point that out. Okay, well, we'll get all our signals straight here. A third conviction. Through the prophets, God criticizes Israel from trampling on the poor, taking bribes in court, violently enlarging its territory, etc. God hates hollow worship apart from faithful political and economic life. Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an overflowing stream. Puritans therefore commended a worldly faithfulness. And you see Presbyterians owe a fair amount to Puritans. It's kind of like part of where they came from. Insisting that commitment to God's sweeping reign or commonwealth pushes the faithful to participate in many social roles and institutional settings beyond the cloister. So you have parents participating in families. You have managers participating in businesses, physicians in medical practices, citizens in nations. When Martin Luther left the cloister to marry a nun, it meant that he could end up washing dirty diapers. So I want you to think about that, because what it means, that's one thing you don't do in the cloister, see? He wants you somewhere else. And so does this kind of Protestantism want you somewhere else. It's got, in fact, points polemics that are not fair against the cloister. It likes it, it hates it so much, right? These are different sorts of social roles aim at distinctive goods. Parents pursue relationships of mutual care. Managers pursue efficiency, physicians attend to persons' health, and citizens pursue justice. We don't ordinarily ask every parent to attend to someone's medical health. They can do that in an informal way, but they're not trained to do it. Love of God and neighbor thus may become incarnate in specific roles and aims. But sin or corrupted interests in things such as inordinate wealth and power also abounds. The question therefore becomes, how may these many roles be properly oriented? Puritans answered by being directed to the public good of the divine commonwealth, by being directed to the public good of the divine commonwealth. Richard Baxter, who is a 17th century guy, claimed that a parent's duty to train her child in the faithful and just performance of social roles and responsibilities serves not only the child's good, but also the wider public good. He reasoned that children, after all, become adults who shape society and on whom others depend. So the next time you meet someone who operates well, is really helpful socially, say maybe a little thank you, potentially, not necessarily, but potentially, to the parents that turned them out that way, because they didn't do it by themselves. A physician's role, said Baxter, is to serve God and neighbor, and thus also the public good, through practices that aim at, quote, saving of men's lives and health, he said. To do this, one obtains specialized training and skills. But when physicians fail to treat those unable to pay, personal gain corrupts, says Baxter, medicine's true aim. You can begin to line out some implications of that for contemporary medical practice if you like, and it's not difficult to do. That's from your local 17th century Puritan now. For Reformed Christians, reflection shows how some practices and skills learned in the world, e.g., for instance, competently repairing brakes, contribute to the wider good. And if you think about it, if you've got a mechanic who cannot competently repair your brakes, you're in a lot worse shape than if you have an incompetent professor. Those brakes might fail, and you've been down 77, you don't want that, right? So it's a matter of moral importance that if you're going to be a mechanic, you be a good one. That's good. Nevertheless, their chief aims, the chief aims of these practices and skills may be undercut by corrupting influences. Gain is the final goal, or something like that. Puritans believed that some roles, such as running gambling houses, are incompatible with loving neighbor and pursuing the divine commonwealth. I know that sounds old-timey, and I'm not going to try and elaborate on it, though I did grow up not too far from Atlantic City, and if you think casinos are simply benign, you got another thing coming. We may question today selling semi-automatic weapons or telemarketing calculated to confuse seniors, things of that sort. Again, conscientious Christians may refuse business as usual, where legitimate roles become badly skewed. There were some airline pilots a few years ago based in Texas who refused to work flights that the U.S. government was using to separate migrant children from their families at the border. They got some coverage. The airlines got a little upset. They didn't want to get someone like you upset about it. And so they reversed their policy and asked the government to quit it. You know, not a bad timeout. The guy who started it is a guy named Hunt Palmquist. I wish I could get him to come to my church. Okay, so the basic idea here is that a good life and a good society pursue multiple aims or goods that may contribute to the divine commonwealth or reign. Loyalty to that commonwealth, Puritans believed, sometimes feeds revolutionary commitments. They were involved in at least 4 of them. Presbyterian ethos joins them in favoring Republican policies with checks on the powers, inevitably sinful, of individuals, communities, and institutions. Not Republican in terms of U.S. politics, Republican like in the UK, as opposed to a monarchy. Okay, that's what goes on in this tradition here. Developing Baxter's ideas that parents in contemporary social democracies might also ask whether public schools and other institutions that support families are in good working order. That would be a fair thing to bring up. Contemporary corporatized medicine, especially with respect to access by the poor, seems ripe for transformative impulses. I think everyone in the society knows that already. You keep doing it. Not to mention fitting responses to repressive societies, systemic racism, unequal access to education, and so forth. And so what I want to conclude by saying is that here is an ethos of a particular religious community. It's not everyone. It's not even 13.5%. It's just how many Presbyterians, which is a sliver of that. Here's an ethos that encourages political participation, but also stands in tension with some ethai or ethoses. You know, I looked that up all over the place to try and figure out how to say it, and no one's really sure, prominent in our society. But can there be more than one ethos out there? In fact, there can be in a pluralist society. For example, which ethoses does it seem in tension with? A commercial capitalist ethos that negatively impacts medical care, supports growing inequalities, and undermines good quality public education, etc. An American exceptionalism, Christian nationalism, etc., commitments that conflate God's expansive commonwealth with uncritical American patriotism. Is simply not true that the United States of America is the commonwealth of God. No period would have ever said that. Another tension with a therapeutic ethos that regards individual personal growth as the highest value. You know, M. Scott Peck once said that the purpose of marriage was the personal growth of the particular individuals involved. He changed his mind, fortunately, about a decade later. I mean, what does it take, to change your mind about something like that? Maybe being married for a while. It also is opposed to a bloated rhetoric of self-righteousness that undercuts meaningful public discussions and debates. And I could elaborate on that, but why try? I mean, it's all over the place in this country, right? And it also is in tension with current manifestations of perennial tendencies toward own group loyalty, paired with enmity toward outsiders, which is a primate characteristic. It's not just a characteristic of human beings. And you can see it in racism, LGBTQ phobia, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslimism, and all sorts of things. And it's also a great political song to play. Works almost every time in every generation to a degree. So these are the sorts of things that I think this ethos would stand against. Does it tell you exactly what to vote for? Not really. But it does have a general direction set to it. It's not without content, and it's not neutral. So, thanks.
Thank you so much to our panelists. I want to open the floor right now, right away, for you to engage with our panelists. What questions or responses would you like to offer to the room? Who would like to be the first? Sure, thanks.
Susan, you talked about various declines and so forth. And based on what Doug has just said about our college's tradition, has the college fallen down in not promoting and emphasizing this reformed heritage that we have that really speaks to so much of this kind of turmoil that we are experiencing across the country? And particularly, does it speak to, and I don't know how much of this is on campus, the Christian nationalism that is damn frightening in terms of its faith interpretations?
William, this is being taped. Okay.
I'll do it again.
I don't know if there is a schism between what the students today and the type of students that we used to attract in terms of the age decline. And a third of the nuns are 20 to 29. And I don't know, we no longer have chapel. We no longer have a department of religion. We have religious studies. I don't know if the college, quite frankly, should be promoting a certain religion. I think we promote things such as justice, community, faith. I think we promote the need to do good works, but I don't know if I think the college should promote a certain religion. And I know as much, about the Reformed tradition. I was born a Methodist. I was a Catholic for a while. Now I'm a Presbyterian. I've never been a Baptist. So I don't know enough about the Presbyterian Church and how that heritage may have been passed down, or really what it is today. And I think we have more diversity on campus. And as you have that diversity, you're going to see more diversity in terms of the nuns. And I'm not saying the students here are a-religious, but it would surprise me if they're more religious than the people that came before them. I mean, the older students and perhaps the faculty. So in one way to answer your question, I don't think the student body itself reflects that profile of a Davidson student 30 years ago, 20 years ago. I'm into politics. Is that politic enough?
I was glad to skew the microphone. I can hear you.
Sorry, I have a couple questions, but I'll ask one first and then I can go back to the first one's for, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. Is it Dr. Ceka?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very good.
So I just had a quick question about the paradox. And I don't study this, so this is all informal stuff. So, but if it disappears, if the second side of the paradox isn't viewed as religious identities, but race and ethnicity, and Europeans have a very different way of working with race and ethnicity than Americans. So we wouldn't put those factors as race, but so I'm German Mexican. I spent a lot of time in Germany and Romania and Eastern Europe, and many of those categories are racial ethnic categories. And I think they would put Muslims in there too, at least based on my favorite evidence, anecdote, and hearsay. So I'm just curious for you, is it really religious identity on the right, or does it disappear if you make it race ethnicity?
Yeah, excellent question. There's an overlap. Racial identity is considered to be an ascriptive identity, something you cannot change, right? Something you're born with and you cannot really change. Religious identity comes very close to it in terms of how ascriptive it is. And I think in the European context, the two go hand in hand. There is a racial element to it, but it's not only racial. And the reason I'm saying that is because the Muslim population of Europe is very diverse. It comes from diverse parts of the world and non-European countries. So some of the folks that are Muslim and who have been stigmatized because of their religious identity are as white as all of the other Europeans. Others, obviously less so, depends on the part of the world they come from. So while race and ethnic identity can overlap with religious identity, I think there is a particular anti-Muslim sentiment among sectors of the population that transcends race. It's not just about race, but you're right. It can feel almost racial, but then when you see it travels beyond just race, it's clear that there's more to it. It's an excellent question. Thank you.
Hello. So a lot of the institutions that represent religion, like the church, also has to do with achieving a sense of community. So I want to ask, based on your research and your expertise, since religiosity is decreasing in both the European and American context, what would you say are the biggest increases in terms of other institutions that offer this sense of community?
Bess, do you want to take that first? I'll give it a stab. I'm not sure there are places that help encourage religiosity. Sometimes is measured by church attendance, how often one prays, and there's not much that takes the place of that. And I think that when we think of the nuns, for example, they're really anti-institution, and they're very upset with the, as I said, the church and its stance, the church as an organized religion. They may identify, let's say they look at the Catholic Church and they've been very unhappy with the Catholic Church response to child abuse. And so I think that I don't know that there's something that replaces it. And that's a decline that perhaps people are going to have to respond to, because if we have a decline in civic engagement, right, that's not a very good thing. And a decline in the number of people that identify with a party, that's not a very good thing. And that's because there is something about identification with a group. And I say identification as an unaffiliated or a nun, and identification in terms of partisanship. We aren't members You are members of a church, I will say that, but you aren't members of a political party. You identify. And so I don't think there is something to take the place. Now, people have said, yoga and some of these other things, and people do go and have some, one said, GUS, the God upstairs. And they do talk about a higher being, and they do think about a community of people that care about some social issues, but not ones that are particularly addressed in a religious institution.
I can add to that, and my response follows, I think, quite nicely from what Dr. Robert just said. A parallel trend that has been happening in Europe and is well documented, it's happened in the last 50, 60 years, is the rise of post-materialist values. And this has to do, or is closely related to the economic development of Western Europe, to the boom after the Second World War. And the basic theory is that as people's basic needs are met for safety, physiological needs, safety, they quickly move on to higher levels of needs. So this is part of Maslow's hierarchy. And the rise of post-materialist values has led to an increasing number of people identifying as post-materialists that put a lot more emphasis on values related to self-actualization, to achieving one's full potential, including creative activities, and less so on material goods. So what is the implication of that for the community aspect? And I think this is sort of a really good question. I don't think that the decline of organized religion has been replaced, or the feeling of community that it brings has been replaced fully by this, but some of it is more individualized niche pursuits of people in the pursuit of self-actualization. Dr. Roberts mentioned yoga. I can think of a variety of other pursuits that people have been engaged in. How satisfactory that has been, I'm not so sure. I don't exactly know. There is a lot of research that shows discontent of various kinds, discontent with political institutions, a decrease in trust in political institutions, and also horizontal trust, trusting your neighbors, trusting others. So that optimization of society, I think it has to do with the decline of organized religion. But post-materialist values and the pursuit of happiness through post-materialist values, including self-actualization, has partially, I think, taken the place of that form of belonging that existed before.
Yeah. I'd like to say that I think that also connects with stuff about theology. Theology is not fundamentally a matter of where you're a member. It's a matter of how you approach life, your orientation in life, and how you think, and your commitments. And so it has to do with affectivities and loyalties. It has to do with an orientation in life. And if I understand what the sociologists are saying about people who are unmoored, it is that they're more likely to try and construct that on their own and in other ways. So one sort of interesting question for a bunch of religious associations is how they represent with integrity their own ethos and the way they want to orient people. What is the orientation? Not just like, what is to become a member and how do you check this box and that box, but how do you approach life? How is it that a religious tradition furnishes a wisdom for living that someone might find attractive or even helpful? Now, that seems to me to be a really helpful place to start asking about theology and religion, courtesy of some of these developments. I'm not saying that you can bring them about just to get a nice avenue for theology, but if you ever wanted to have an environment where people want to talk about how they understand the world and their worldviews and how they regard everything, what's valuable and what's right and what's wrong, you're in it. So I don't think of this as a terrible sort of thing for preaching or a terrible sort of thing for religious associations. Maybe if we go around counting cars in parking lots, maybe if we go around trying to figure out how many people check one box or other, it's going to look that way. How I walk to church. So you're not going to see my car in the parking lot. All I'm trying to say here is maybe increasing members isn't the whole ballgame. Maybe the ballgame is something else, like trying to articulate an integral gospel or something that orients people in life. Maybe the point is the increase of love of God and neighbor, not just winning elections. Maybe the point is not just having bigger churches and more cars and lots. Now, if that's true, then maybe there's a little room to move here. And it might not be such a tragic circumstance as it first appears. It might be kind of fun.
Well, and to point out, a Pew Research study said, and remember I said 30 to 34% of Americans self-identify as nuns. 55% say that religion is a force of religion as a good for society. 55% say it is a source of good in society. Only 20% say it does harm more than good. And then you have the don't knows. Does it strengthen morality in society? 53%. It weakens morality, 12%. Does it mostly bring people together? 50%.
Yeah.
And I think you look at, I ran across belief, behavior, and belonging. And I think people can find those things in many different ways. One thing that it could be, I mean, maybe it's the growth of a megachurch, maybe it's the growth of a third party. People want, as Putnam says in Tocqueville, they want to be a part of something greater than themselves.
I think also apropos of this question about current students and former students, I know some people who were former students, but I didn't know them when they were here as students, so I can't tell you about their behavior. I never went to a school that required chapel attendance, so I don't know what that's like either. You know, kid from New Jersey just doesn't happen. But I can tell you that if you want to put out a shingle and talk about theology and ethics in this environment with current students, well, you can get people coming out of the woodwork. So there's something that people are interested in terms of orienting themselves in lives, and they may do this a variety of different ways, but you know, they're interested in it.
Friends, we'll take one more question from the floor, and then we'll continue during our reception. Go ahead.
Professor Ottati, I got a question to you following up with the orienting principle. So I'm from India, and a preeminent psychologist, social psychologist in India, Ashish Nandi, he finds that the city of Kochi in southern India, Kerala, has had little to no records of religious or communal violence. So in his research, he finds he debunks a lot of reasons people give, which are, you know, typically material or, you know, higher education. All of these he debunks, and he finds that amity, and I'm quoting him here, he says, amity in the city of Kochi was based on mutual hatred of other groups. As an example, a Jewish community living in Kochi for 2,000 years would not allow their children to marry Jewish people from another community that was living there only for the last 500 years. So as he investigates this, he finds that each group has its own religious and cultural mythology. And in their respective mythologies, their own people do very well, and the other is usually evil. But the constant thread throughout all these religious mythologies for the different groups was that nobody could define themselves without the presence of the other. And I think religious texts, not necessarily churches, but religion, or at least, you know, discourse about religion under, you know, we do that on, like you mentioned, the shingles. I think religious texts provide some guidance about how to treat the other. That's what the orienting principle you're mentioning. So what's going on with the failure of that essential precept? Like you said, the love of neighbor not being translated into politics, whether we're looking at Eastern European politics. And, you know, some of it is really alarming when a majority of them would vote to deny political representation for the other. So what role can theologies play in this discourse?
That's a really good question. And I think there are at least two aspects to it that be of some importance. So one is that in order to regard others with respect and so forth, you also need to know who you are, right? I mean, you can't decide that all of a sudden everyone, it's a night in which all people have no particular religion or no particular ideas. If you do that and you claim that you're going to respect the next Muslim that walks in the door, they're not going to feel that way, I don't think. So one thing is respect for religious particularities in others who remain other and have their particularities probably implies some sense of your own particularity. It doesn't have to be a religious particularity. You take your pick, but you need to understand that you are not the universal person and they are not the universal person either. They're particulars, and you want to try and work through that. So one way, of course, to work with a bunch of people is to define yourself in relationship to them. I think that's important, and it can be done with respect sometimes too. Huh? The other sort of thing I think is that teachings like love your enemy, teachings like that these things that go beyond these in-group preferences are constantly and have constantly been under assault throughout the history of humanity. There is not some golden age back there where everyone turned around and said, hey, gee whiz, I think all these other people are not like me or wonderful. Let's go out to dinner. It's more likely to beating each other's heads in. And that happens all the time. So there is a struggle of faiths and commitments in human history that has to do with what you're going to do with an other who remains other. In some traditional languages of some groups, some American, indigenous American groups, the word for a member of a tribe and the word for a human being is the same word. Okay, that's fine. That's not so unusual. That happens. So one day someone shows up who's not a member of your tribe. What are they? And how do you regard them? That kind of a question comes up more often than one might think in the history of the world. And then don't forget all the other interests that are operating here that don't want you to regard others with a kind of respect. Think of the political utility of us versus them rhetoric. I mean, my goodness, here we are in the southeastern United States. If you can't figure out the political utility of that rhetoric here, you're just never gonna. So you're up against some big forces here, but it's worth going forward. So one thing I think is respect particularities, meaning have some sense of your own particularity too. And the second, try and understand that you really are in contest with a variety of other interests, et cetera, that might work things differently. As far as, stuff, school people from the school here and whether or not they take up a religious tradition, I don't know. But I do think the school does try to give you the idea that if you're going to go into a profession, it ought somehow to contribute to the public good. Now maybe that's just a holdover from old time Puritanism or whatever it is. I think it's still sort of alive and well. I don't want to overstate that, right? We know what the most popular majors are in Hawaii, and there's no point in gainsaying that kind of stuff. On the other hand, that idea is still out of the box, and no one's put it back in the box, and that idea is still around. So I think it can be done.
Will you help me thank our panelists for tonight's discussion? This concludes our Davidson Forum panel discussion on religion and politics. We hope you will grab something sweet or drink something warm, have a safe trip back home, and we will see you next time. Thank you.